Full disclosure, this video stemmed from a personal grievance, but I've done, I think, sufficient diligence to distance myself from becoming one of those internet shouty men who only half read a headline and lose their mind for views. With that said, let's get into talking about a company called VFS Global, Visas and Borders, and the privatization of government responsibilities. So to start off, I want to clarify this won't be the usual discussion of privatization, which tends to be around some manner of utility, natural resource, or public good. Maybe you've heard privatization discussed in relation to railways, oil and natural gas, or water and electricity companies. Another thing people debate the privatization of is services, like the United States Post Office. One further reading I suggest for a discussion of where privatization of services in particular goes is a video by the leftist Cooks. Here's a no-context clip from the video.
I think you need therapy, Neil.
I love Ireland!
Or maybe what comes to mind for you is the topical and far, far darker example of emergency response being farmed out to private companies in, say, Puerto Rico. But I'll temper my rage about that situation so we can talk about the thing I actually wrote a video about. This is going to be a bit different because we're talking about something intangible, like a government service, so different from stuff like railways and resources, but unlike a government service because it isn't designed to interact with or aid to literally service a community. The privatized enterprise we'll be getting into is, in this case, an obligation the government has constructed for itself. The bureaucratic process invented to establish and uphold a set of rules that require a particular process to comply with. If that sounds like nonsense, that's the point. And if it sounds like the government gave itself a job, well, yes and no, but we'll get to that. Borders and border control are nothing new, but there's something about the way their privatization has invented a very Byzantine beast. Instead of dealing with a situation where the government is its own literal gatekeeper, we're in one where, for whatever reason, a third party processes who gets in. In doing so, this third party applies its own understanding of the law, despite lacking authority over the law itself. And it leads to some questions, as privatization always will, over who has authority over the company, and in turn, who the company considers customers, who it is beholden to. Another thing we'll get to. Imagine if you asked your dad if you could go to a friend's house, and he told you to call your friend's dad, who then said you weren't allowed into his house until you sent a letter 4 counties away to some guy the block dads all agreed to pay to process said letters that included your biometric data and information on how much money you made in the Roblox child labor mines that month, and a detailed explanation of why you deserve to go to your friend's house, what games you will be playing, and the added promise that you won't be a detriment to the household or eat too much food at dinner. And then you got your response a month and $400 later. Or something. Look, that's a messy metaphor, so let's just talk about the real thing. Even though this privatization is a bit different from the other common examples, let's start with a short definition of privatization, just to get everyone on the same page. It won't take long. Privatization is the process of turning a facet of the state, public trust, or government function into a privately owned enterprise, though semantically, a private company in this case can still be publicly traded, which brings up some issues that are beyond the scope of this video. Often, this enterprise, this transition to a private system, is accomplished in one of 2 ways, but it's really kind of just one way, which is the government opens something up to companies who bid for the contract to do a job, as broad as that. The alternative way is not opening things up so much as intentionally gutting or withering a function of the state so badly that private companies can compete or become a necessary facet of an industry. This is a twofold tactic because it also serves to expand the idea that government is naturally inept where private companies are sleek and efficient, and due to some coincidental misleading about technicalities and statistics, often this stuff is used as evidence that the government has been made more efficient by farming things out. Ignoring that while official government bureaucracy on record goes down, applicants end up with even more paperwork on their plate. Now, an extension of this is that the value of a service, again, like the post office, comes into question, and a debate forms around profit, which misses the whole point that services are services, not revenue generators. The end point of this supposes government ought not be responsible for services, but what is the purpose of government if not services? Regulation? Isn't that a service? Government should be more than just a list of approved private sector providers. Would you rather your taxes go to some fund that gets contracted to companies that don't answer to you to do things in a way you have no control over? Do you really want a government that does nothing but taxation and civil asset forfeiture? Is that your ideal? I'm not going to get into the efficacy of application fees for getting forms of identification or anything. The state wants you identified, usually, and limiting monetary hurdles is thus in their interest. To that end, I highly doubt the state mandates IDs as some form of cartel so they can sell more plastic cards for profit. But what if they did? Okay, so it's not literally an effort to sell plastic, but there's something going on here. Let's just start with what this company is paid to do, and then we'll jump back into their history and controversies. VFS Global is a multinational corporation that handles the process of visa application and approval for a multitude of countries. The name in full is Visa Facilitation Services Global. Maybe that doesn't sound all that standout. I mean, so they're doing some bureaucracy on behalf of governments. Big deal. But borders are a big deal, if you haven't noticed, given their prominence in political conversations that have dominated the West ever since the fabled end of history. While it may appear mundane, there's something incredibly strange about a sovereign nation paying someone else to tell them who is worthy of coming to or indeed inhabiting their nation. The United States Department of Homeland Security is, as American government departments go, massive and has a plurality of enforcement arms and bureaucratic responsibilities precisely because the concept of security is one the United States sees as paramount. Despite its love of private enterprise, the government would rather take matters into its own hands and be able to coordinate between departments and sub-departments where security is concerned. So let's take an example country that has made a big deal of border enforcement but has opted to privatize their visa process: the United Kingdom. The reason for the United Kingdom's use of this private enterprise is twofold, and this comes back to the ways I said privatization occurs and why. They want to pretend the government is smaller and more efficient than before, and there's debate over if this is true. On some level, the government is governing less because it's just throwing money at a problem rather than having government workers on the case. And on another, they've turned the visa system into a quasi-revenue generator by essentially giving a private company a charter to harass and exploit people who have no other option than to give them money. So it looks efficient on the outside. Smaller payroll and money comes in. Yay, private industry. And it becomes another example to add to the textbooks of how government is inefficient and worthless. And all the while, the UK gets to maintain plausible deniability about how obtuse, selective, and exploitative the process is because it's not in their hands. Yet another win. But as the presence of deniability suggests, there are some things to be denied. The applicant, who is by design not a citizen and, as we'll later see, not a customer, now has to pay a lot more for the privilege to do more paperwork than ever. The fees are bad, sure, but I think the other part, the question of customer, is far more insidious. Who are VFS's customers? Who is VFS beholden to? Who does the company consider as its customer? Now, what actually got me on the thread of making a video about this in the first place instead of just being privately mad was the fact that this company has terrible reviews online. And sure, it's a bureaucratic enterprise. Of course people are going to bemoan their existence. But unlike when the county jail has 13 one-star reviews on Google for slow room service, or when the Department of Motor Vehicles gets a 2 out of 10 rating for being the Department of Motor Vehicles, this is a private company, and it's one that is, more or less, beholden to nobody. Like the state enterprises, the public enterprises, it has a monopoly over its role. You can't go to some alternative DMV. You could, I guess, drive to another particular office, but you're not going to avoid having to deal with the DMV itself. Much the same here. If you want a British visa, you deal with VFS. But with the DMV, there is the idea, at least, that you can, in some way, reach out to, or organize with, or around somebody who has the power to change how something is running. In theory, the bureaucratic organs, as obtuse as they are beholden to local government, to city councilors and elected officials, to complaints, to legislation. But is that the case for VFS? Does VFS have any reason to address the one-star reviews? Can one write to the Home Office complaining about the process? Yes, but will they care if you're not already in the country? Or even if you are? By nature of who the process is for, users are not citizens. It almost seems like anyone who would ever need this process would be exactly the people who have no say in how it's handled, by design. And what politician is going to take to task an organization whose actions intersect with near 0% of their constituency? Nobody represents the people seeking a visa in this ordeal. And the people seeking a visa can't fall into that capitalism cliche of voting with their wallet because they're not customers. They're cattle. So again, I ask, who is the customer of VFS Global? The answer is the British government, not the people paying the company fees that are on average 300% higher than they used to be, not the people getting scammed via premium services that prey on the ignorance and sometimes illiteracy of applicants, nor the people who are entrusting this company with the responsibility of arbitrating for them a life-altering situation. And the absurd part is, all these hurdles, issues, concerns, and inefficiencies are actually, quite possibly by design. If one understands the goal of the British government to be creating a smooth and transparent process, well, then this is an abject failure. But if the goal is to make the process difficult in a dozen small ways to disincentivize mobility of people while promising it is within their values that people may come to their shores, then this partnership with VFS and the maintaining of the plausible deniability shroud is actually remarkably efficient. The multinational nature of VFS Global adds yet another layer to all this. They aren't a British company, and I want to stress that. They're a Swiss company. Sorry, no, I mean Swedish, a common mistake. No, wait, Emirati, but this says founded in India. Mauritius? Let's get into the VFS history. VFS Global is a multinational corporation that handles the process of visa application and approval for a... Wait, we've been here before. What the hell does multinational mean? It sounds a bit intuitive. A company that operates in multiple nations. Done, right? Well, it's time we talk through the history of the company to really get a sense of what multinational means here. VFS was spawned as a side hustle by the Swiss upscale travel company Quoni. The services Quoni offered up to the point of creating and aside from VFS are aimed towards individuals looking for travel packages and no-hassle luxury trips abroad. That's how the facilitation element of VFS became part of their domain. But VFS is their only division that has national governments as its clients. Quoni was purchased by a private equity firm based in Stockholm called EQT, which I have to imagine is a pun on the word equity and a shameful one at that. This is where the Swedish ownership thing came in. It's only going to get more confusing from here. Suffice to say, the confusion is part of the process. Companies often do things like this for the sake of evading legislation or cherry-picking what laws they have to follow. Because I didn't give the leftist cooks a fair shake with the no context segment before, let me use another clip to provide an example of how this deal of intentionally obtuse business practices, like creating parent companies for parent companies that are more nested than Matryoshka dolls, is to their benefit.
According to the report, almost all sales profits recorded by the two companies, oh yes, Apple Sales International and Apple Operations Europe, two very different companies, clearly. Remember that, it's important. Sales profits from the two companies were internally attributed to a head office. The Commission's assessment showed that these head offices existed only on paper and could not have generated such profits. They were using a tax trick. In Ireland, you can claim capital allowance, tax deduction basically, for intangible assets. So, in 2015, an Irish subsidiary of Apple, company number one, and definitely an Irish company, Steve McJobs and all that, purchased $300 billion worth of intangible assets from a different subsidiary of Apple, which enabled Apple to write off $300 billion fucking dollars as a capital allowance against future Irish profits.
And much like Apple and a ton of other companies use Ireland as a tax haven, this is where Mauritius, the island country off the coast of Africa in the Indian Ocean, not very historically linked to the Emirates, Switzerland, Sweden, or India, comes into play, also as a tax haven. Hey, so here's a question. Where is Disney incorporated in the United States? California? Florida? Surely somewhere that they own an entire county worth of land would make sense, right? It's probably in some huge corporate building, not a Disney castle, but they've got to at least put it somewhere relevant, right? I'll give it a second. Wilmington, Delaware. So why don't the Disney adults incorporate Wilmington into their mouse-centric Hajj? Well, the Disney Enterprises HQ isn't exactly magical. Their headquarters is a single office space inside a building they don't own with like 3 rooms and 10 employees. That's weird, right? Can't imagine they've got a lot of room for doing all the admin there. So why? Unsurprisingly, it's tax evasion. Delaware has low corporate taxes and a host of, shall we say, perks similar to the Emirates with respect to obfuscation of business practices. As a consequence, Wilmington is a bizarre city that, the second the work week is over, empties out as businessmen vanish back to anywhere but Delaware. To give you a sense of how absurd this place is, Chase Bank, you know, the famous New York bank, is partially headquartered there and actually has a large building, unlike Disney. But when I was last there were 0 Chase Bank branches in the state. Of course, Disney does a lot of business in a lot of places, and there are actually many HQs for different facets of their organization, and sorry, this is a massive tangent, but actually that's kinda how VFS works too. That's how they can be simultaneously based in Dubai, taking advantage of their obtuse corporate laws, while having a parent company, VF Worldwide Holdings, based in Mauritius, a tax haven country. And on top of that, VF Worldwide's parent company was, VFS Cayman. No points for guessing what tax haven country they're based in, and it just keeps going. There's a twist to this whole parent company thing, but we're gonna table that because it's a tangent that deserves its own space. The India link is twofold. India is where VFS was founded by Zubin Karkaria, who saw that the embassies of many countries struggled to process all the visa applications they received during his work at Quoni. He then offered his solution, handing the admin over to his private organization based in Mumbai where costs would be low. And by nature of who would ultimately apply for many visas to Commonwealth nations, the customers would be local. You see, India has negative net migration, which means people immigrate from India more than to India, and they largely go to countries of the Anglosphere, which, aside from the USA, are almost entirely Commonwealth nations. Point being, the UK is a country that receives immigrants from India, and VFS Global has entrenched itself in that process. Which raises a few questions, primary among them being, how did they entrench themselves? Well, despite what I said earlier about the US wanting to be in control of its border processing, in the case of India, they actually handed part of that process over to Karkaria and VFS, opting into a contract. This gave VFS the capital and, more importantly, the credibility to approach the UK with a similar offer. And the rest is history, sort of. They got some big high-profile contracts and then they just kind of spread around from there. They allege working with 65 client countries, but it's a bit hard to dig through all their info and see how entrenched they are with the country's processing. But the point is that they are very well established now. Prior to opening VFS, Karkaria worked with Quoni, the Swiss parent company, and saw how much of a headache the visa process was, and evidently vowed to make it much, much worse in the pursuit of profit. In his own words, this is the positive pitch of VFS. For those applying for a visa, it means better and more personalized customer service with better physical and technological infrastructure. For example, over the years we've introduced a wide range of services, such as doorstep visa services, a choice of when people can schedule their visa appointments, and personal assistance with completing their visa application. But the reality, according to 2 articles in The Independent, is far from personalized or better. Beyond the myriad of 1-star reviews, customers have also cited issues with wait times, appointment times, poor processing, lack of clarity on timetables, and alleged scams. The alleged scams are varied, and in one case was bad enough that the Home Office made them stop when renewing their contract in 2018. The cost of their, I will stress, non-optional service is left unclear. Here's some info provided by another article by The Independent, written in conjunction with a publication called Finance Uncovered, who we'll talk about in a second. Some people have also alleged that the company offers poorly defined services, particularly in impoverished communities, like the opportunity to pay more for a VIP waiting room while being serviced, with some expectation that you're paying to be a VIP and thus processed more quickly, efficiently, or with the low bar of lacking errors. As for Finance Uncovered, it turns out I'm not the only one with a vendetta against VFS, because one of the major articles that broke the story of how bad this company is came from Finance Uncovered, and they were put on the warpath when their journalists were denied visas. The article in question says, "We had noticed a consistently high number of talented investigative journalists turned down for entry into the UK, so we began to examine the entire process." So, despite all this negative attention and bad service, there's still a working relationship with the UK Home Office because what VFS promises to the UK is profit through process. And they deliver, in part due to the extractive fees, which leads to complaints that go nowhere, because the Home Office isn't inclined to care about complaints directed at a company, nor complaints coming from beyond their borders. Since VFS hooked the contract in 2014, which gave the company responsibility over 70% of the UK visa applications, the Home Office has gone from generating around £28.73 in revenue per application to £122.56. That's a 300% increase in revenue. Which sounds nice, maybe, if you don't think about it, yay prosperity, but that revenue doesn't get plucked from the ether. Efficiency alone can't turn bureaucracy profitable. It comes from migrants, people coming for study, for opportunity, to be with family. And as one might expect, people who are willing to uproot their whole lives don't tend to already be coasting through life. These are often vulnerable people, people without many other options. Thus the scams I mentioned before. Is someone who has no choice but to deal with you your customer. In any other dynamic, we'd recognize the extortion going on. And going back to students, these are people who, even when from places within the global north, within the walled world, which we'll get to soon, still have to navigate VFS, still have to give in to VFS's extortionate fees. By nature, international students are people who have already locked in to going to another country for school, taken student loans, planned the next years of their life around a huge decision. And VFS is there to collect a toll. In the instance I'm familiar with, there were several fees, including a $5 bonus charge if one wanted text SMS updates on their application process, which I include in my understanding of scam stuff because they sent like all of one text and didn't use that function to clarify any of the actual horrible miscommunications that occurred due to the compartmentalized process where the UK government lacked any window into what VFS was doing. Like, is this worth $5? All of this to lead us to an important question. Is a set of bad customer reviews really going to damper such a lucrative relationship? No, it's untouchable for the most part. In terms of the potential for organizing against the whole thing, students might have the strongest angle of attack, so to speak, and it's not very strong. As I see it, they're poised to pressure universities to then pressure the government about stuff like this, because, myopic as it sounds, international students and their domestic student associates are among the more globally enfranchised population, educated by definition, and thus have more of a voice and impact. I don't have any actual solutions or paths to take, nor do I mean to lay this on students as some call to action responsibility. It merely appears, to me, to be a potential avenue for at least applying some pressure. Sorry it's a bit of a nested option, what with international students working with domestic students to bother the university into bothering the government into bothering the Home Office, but, nested, international... Oh, okay, yeah, let's talk about the final boss. VFS Global is a multinational corporation that their parent company is evil. Has anyone here ever heard of Blackstone? It was in the news not so long ago, but they tend to keep to the background of things by just owning the guys who own the guys who are the public-facing business. Kind of like how Burger King is owned by a company that's owned by a company that's Brazilian. If you need more of a hint, Blackstone came up for being the guys who have like single-handedly ruined the US housing market, swooping in after the financial crash that the members of the board helped cause back when they were Lehman Brothers, and then like bought up houses everywhere, sometimes even pretending to be individuals buying houses instead of an eldritch horror. That Blackstone. Well, they're the parent company for VFS, and they have done their fair share of bad things. Like, I gotta say, when I started researching this, I didn't expect it to lead back to the investment firm so ghoulish in its actions and so cartoonish in its name that it sounds like it was made up to facilitate a conspiracy theory or to be the bad guy in an immersive sim. These guys have a hand in so many companies and are just squeezing whoever they can for whatever drops of blood they can get. As far as evil goes, their actions in the real estate market should be sufficiently convincing on its own, but if you want a story of active violations of their own terms of service to the extreme detriment of customers, they own Motel 6 and presided over the scandal where the chain sold customer data to ICE, leading to a massive class action lawsuit, which the victims won. Also, apparently they had a hand in ruining oat milk? Wait, okay, no, this isn't a Blackstone video, I'm dialing it back. Point is, VFS is a for-profit venture designed to extort people with a complete disregard for ethics, and that's why it nests so perfectly into the culture of its parent company and the British Empire. There's one last thing we have to talk about for now, and that's why this all matters, with a brief discussion of why visas even exist in the first place. Okay, so this is a gaming history channel thing. Let's get into the history of borders for a second. In the end, it probably sounds like a silly question to ask why borders exist, because, well, of course they exist. They exist. There's a presumption that borders are in some way at their platonic ideal now, that in the past governments merely lacked the resources to police them as they are now, but would have liked to. Quick note before we go any further, there is, in fact, a whole history of travel restrictions for underclasses of people, and in turn, a rich history of how free mobility changed the opportunity of millions of people, like the abolition of serfdom, but that's beyond the scope of what I'm talking about here, so I'll just leave it noted that I know it exists, so I sound smart, and then move on. Without getting into the whole huge topic of, shall we say, selective immigration policies in the 19th and 20th century, it has been argued that borders existed in a relatively open state before the World Wars. In an article by Drew Keeling for the World Economic Forum, you know what, never mind. No, it's fine. The short of the argument is that the open travel of people was snuffed out, first by the violence of World War I, the literal blockades and all, and then by the global financial crash, which made it impossible to pick and move to some ideal unharmed place. Everyone not insulated from the global economy got the crash eventually. It rippled out. Even the Soviet Union got caught in some of the waves. In light of that, the post-war crash wasn't something people could just move away from. Mix that with the post-war fragility of the New Order, uncomfortable unresolved hostility, a global plague we forget existed half the time, and just general lack of access to travel, and it just ground to a halt. And after that, another half-century of uncertainty, war, and hostility made sure it didn't start up again. This prior openness is part of why any favorite European painter or writer, general problematic fave you might have from 1700 onward has a section of their biography/wiki page where they just spent a half-decade in Paris. Passports, and by extension visas, could be described as one's key to the world, an item with which one journeys. And that's whimsical. But that framing implies that passports are some natural condition that have existed for eons, that visas were a thing people have always needed to travel. For a moment, imagine a passport before the invention of photography, just some shitty drawing of you done by a municipal clerk in pencil or something. No, it didn't happen. Passports and visas, though other documents proving the right to travel existed beforehand, are squarely a post-1914 invention. The existence of the particular form of travel document that the modern passport derives from began with the British Nationality and Status Aliens Act of 1914. From there, the League of Nations agrees to adopt the documentation format sometime in 1920, and that's kinda it, truth be told. It becomes a staple of travel without much fanfare, aside from the fact people didn't take too keenly to the early British passports that provided, descriptors of their appearance that went beyond eye color and complexion. So there's this concept called the walled world, and I rather like it. As a framing device, the reality is obviously bad. Now, you may have heard of the concept of the Global South and Global North before, sort of as a modern rebrand of the First World, Third World distinction. Without digging too deep into it, the idea is that there are different ways of articulating the wealth, resource, and opportunity inequalities of the world, centering different origins. While some people might call the third world framing misleading or even offensive in how pejorative the term has gotten, think basically coded language for shithole countries, etc., the origin of the term had a function speaking to non-aligned nations during the Cold War, obviously from the Western lens, given who got to be the first world. Frameworks exist to be iterated on and re-articulated, and thus the global North-South divide more centered on typical victims of colonialism and imperialism being in the global South, places neoliberal institutions like the IMF would call underdeveloped. Personally, I find the term a bit messy on a near semantic level, but I won't knock anyone who uses it. Maybe I'll save my thoughts on that for another day. All this to say that another framing is the walled world, and the reason I like this one is mostly that it's not tied to a geographic shorthand. It's got a bit more nuance baked into it than Global South, and in doing so doesn't implicitly presume that places like the Balkan states are merely outliers in the north, but actively pushed away by the inner wall states. I will, however, be the first to admit there are issues with this concept and especially this projection of the idea. It's outdated, for one. The map is over a decade old and the borders of walled Europe have shifted to include parts of the East. It may be a bit irresponsible to even share a decade-old map like this, but again, this would all have to be a topic for another day. I'm more here for the framing device, which I don't find carries as many inaccuracies as the map. I don't intend to linger on this point so much as use the walled world as a general shorthand for a division between the rich states that make it hard to immigrate and the regions of emigration in the 21st century. something I think is non-controversial to present without mythologizing Fortress Europe. At the risk of sounding like I'm complaining from a peak of privilege, one thing that has always surprised me in retrospect about this whole thing, the world after history in a Fukuyama sense, this world with a neoliberal default and the walled world divide, is that with the advent of free trade, there wasn't also free movement. NAFTA, the poster child of neoliberal policy agreements, which counts among its horrible consequences a revision of the Mexican Constitution that massively scaled back the rights it granted to indigenous people, allowed for the travel of goods, but not people. And I get it, Americans don't want Mexicans coming to their country, but when it comes to their northern border, the travel should be as easy as possible. Racism, yeah, of course. But that's the thing. Part of me is surprised that travel between the countries of the walled world, the rich white global north, did not become significantly easier once the walls came up. Why aren't all the barriers within the wall as relaxed as travel between the EU countries? Doesn't the free trade of goods feel like it necessitates the free travel of people? Don't borders make less and less sense in a globally integrated world with an allegedly global economy? Why keep up the borders, these massive institutional barriers to self-made men, these things that indirectly create privilege by blood in a world that supposedly promotes equal opportunities? Why is it that being born to EU parents of blood descent from a place you've never been somehow makes it far easier to access most of an entire continent? What is that if not privilege by blood, a supposedly eradicated facet of Western society? Well, to come full circle, the free trade, privatization, and borders as we now understand them are all products of that neoliberal world, and the uneven access to migration and integration across societies is a necessary facet of that neoliberal walled world, even between societies within the wall. See, neoliberalism claims to promote the idea of opportunity, sometimes contrasted against equality, as by figures like Margaret Thatcher. But in practice, neoliberal economies demand restrictions. They can't give laborers more options, and thus the flow of people is more restricted than the flow of goods. The alleged value of competition is rendered a myth here. We are walled into where we are born. The free migration of people would mean more power for laborers to control their own fate. Remember what I said about VFS Global having a private monopoly over the arbitration of people's lives? Well, that model is clearly reliant on people desiring to be somewhere else. Their model of business is reliant on the process being difficult. That's how it all started for them. Every once in a while, you might see someone casually lament that they don't live in Nordic socialism or whatever. And whatever issue you might have with those governments, the sentiment the person is expressing is that they believe they're somewhere doing it better and that they want to be there. Even within the walled world, there is disparity between countries, particularly on the lines of legal, social, and labor rights. The United States benefits from tight borders on the rest of the walled world in that its laborers, those born in the labor class, have fewer options. They can't just move to a country where, even working at McDonald's, they'd get healthcare, or have their labor a bit more valued. And that captive labor force means wages can be kept lower. It's another part of that big mechanism which keeps everyone suppressed. Suffice to say, I don't think every country in the world could handle just opening its borders and would flawlessly manage the process and integrate massive waves of people. There's a process for a reason. But I would like to merely suggest that borders contribute to your own constraint, and that they're meant to. Also, one final bit here. Don't get it twisted. I'm not saying this is all just crony capitalism and that there's some ideal corruption-free way that borders and visas could be handled equitably and fairly where profit is plucked from the air instead of the pockets of the poor. So we rambled through a lot of things this time. But the general point is this. Neoliberalism, through either the rigid maintenance of borders and indirect insistence on their natural state, or through the ways it promotes the privatization of intrinsic government functions, undermines its stated goals on more than a few levels. Materially, it promises an end to bureaucracy and the unaccountability of faceless bureaucrats, but what it actually does is shift a budget around, making money through underhanded exploitation of vulnerable people who have to deal with more bureaucracy than ever with fewer protections and avenues of voicing concerns. And ideologically, it undercuts the idea of basic freedoms. Or I guess a counterpoint is that any real Ubermensch worth having in your country will find a way to be granted residence. But I do find it bleak that countries like the UK make it easier for the products of sweatshop labor to enter their country than the people fleeing the conditions of sweatshop labor. VFS Global itself constitutes an inhumane tax on migration that I think will, in time, be viewed about as hostile and absurd as the window tax that led Britons to brick up their windows, or the lesser known but equally thoughtless wallpaper tax. And while it would be a stretch to say that the UK government reveled in the consequence of the window tax, of lessening the burden of literally perceiving the poor, I wouldn't say it's a stretch at all that the government favors the immigration process being made hostile and obtuse, that it means keeping away the poor. Things like reviews on a website are ultimately impotent, and that's what drew me in. I really empathized with that impotent frustration and a bit of the raw humor of seeing a terrible company be irredeemably blasted aside from their sock puppet 5-star reviews, which only made it all funnier. I don't know an easy or even idealistic solution here. I proposed student pressure, but that's all I've really got, short of a much larger and much more idealistic goal of ending borders as we have them now. But I'd like to think there's one out there, or that some form of accountability could ever manifest upon the vultures of VFS. It would be nice. Hey, look at that. Finally back to a political, non-gamer one. I have to do these on occasion or my Twitter mutuals won't think I'm smart. Thanks for watching to here if you did, though I feel like that string of words is like the code word that activates some part of viewer brains and says, close the video, you're done now. And like, fair enough, I won't keep you, and I really do mean thanks, be it for views or likes, or sharing your thoughts, sharing the whole thing, especially subscribing. Oh, and double especially for patrons, which should be on the screen right now. Etienne Garant is my voiced credits patron, and I owe a small apology for missing the credits last time. I don't know, times are tough, so it's nice that people still, help me make these things even though I'm not promising them a VIP waiting room. If for some reason you can't get enough of my dumb little thoughts, there's more videos, or Twitter if you're brain poisoned enough to use Twitter. Every time I promise something for the next time, I end up being wrong, so I'm just gonna say bye for now and check the community tab or Twitter for more precise updates.